In remote Cedar Ridge, Colorado, a struggling single mother was about to make a desperate $15 gamble at a foreclosure auction. Elena Vasquez, a renewable energy consultant for 15 years, spotted potential in a rusted 1940s windmill others dismissed as junk. When her 17-year-old son Miguel began restoring it as his senior project, he discovered Depression-era gold coins and a leather journal revealing an underground network that helped Dust Bowl refugees. What started as salvaging copper wiring for college fees became a community-dividing treasure hunt that would test everything they believed about justice and inherited responsibility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Vasquez pulled into the dusty gravel lot beside the old Whitmore property, her 15-year-old Honda Civic coughing as she shut off the engine. The foreclosure auction banner snapped in the mountain wind, its cheerful red lettering a cruel contrast to the desperation that had driven her here. She sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching other bidders emerge from pickups and SUVs, ranchers in clean Wranglers, antique dealers with practiced eyes, investors clutching clipboards. $53. That's what remained in her checking account after paying the electric bill. $53 to somehow find something, anything, that could bring in enough cash to cover Miguel's college application fees. The deadlines were approaching like storm clouds on the horizon, and her son's dreams hung in the balance. She forced herself out of the car, tugging her worn blazer straight. The October air carried the bite of early snow, and she pulled her jacket tighter as she joined the crowd gathering around the auctioneer's table. Her engineering training kicked in automatically, her eyes cataloging potential salvage opportunities among the scattered remnants of her family's legacy. A rusted farm truck with decent tires, maybe $40 in scrap metal. A collection of hand tools that might fetch $15 at the flea market. Nothing substantial enough to matter, nothing that could bridge the gap between her failing renewable energy consulting business and the reality of raising a brilliant son alone. "Morning, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the property. "Welcome to the Whitmore estate sale. We've got some real treasures here today." Elena suppressed a bitter laugh. Treasures. She'd heard that word too many times in the months since her last major client had cancelled their solar installation project. The renewable energy market in rural Colorado was tough enough without the recession hitting small businesses like a sledgehammer. Every potential client now wanted to wait to see if things improved. Meanwhile, bills kept arriving with mechanical precision. She watched the bidding on the early lots with growing anxiety. Even the junk was going for more than she could afford. A box of old magazines sold for $25. A broken chainsaw went for $35. She checked her phone. Miguel would be getting out of school soon. She'd promised to pick him up, another small economy in a life suddenly full of them. The bus pass money could go toward groceries instead. "Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his assistant dragging forward what looked like a giant metal flower on a rusted stem. "Here we have a vintage 1940s windmill, original air motor design. Great for restoration projects or salvage." Elena's breath caught. The windmill stood nearly 8 feet tall, even in its collapsed state, its steel blades twisted and weather-beaten, but substantial. Her engineer's eye immediately began calculating. Copper wiring in the generator housing, steel components throughout, maybe even some brass fittings. The copper alone could be worth several $100s to the right scrap dealer. The crowd around her shifted, but no hands went up. Someone behind her chuckled. "Who'd want that piece of junk?" "Bidding starts at $5, the auctioneer called. Still no takers. Elena's heart began to race. "Come on, folks, this is a piece of Colorado history. Genuine Depression-era craftsmanship." $250, called out a dealer in the back, more as a joke than a serious bid. Elena raised her hand. $5. The auctioneer nodded. "I have 5. Do I hear 10? Silence stretched across the lot. The dealer who'd bid earlier shook his head with a grin. Elena held her breath, waiting for someone to recognize what she saw. the potential value hidden beneath decades of neglect. Going once at $5, the auctioneer continued. This is your chance to own a piece of the Old West, folks. Still nothing. Elena's mind raced with calculations. The copper wiring alone had to be worth at least $200. Even if she could only recover half that, it would cover Miguel's application fees with money to spare. 15, she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. A few heads turned. The auctioneer brightened. Now I have 15. Do I hear 20? Elena's palms grew damp. $15 represented nearly a third of her remaining money, but the windmill had to be worth more in salvage than she was bidding. Had to be. She'd built her career on understanding energy systems, on seeing potential where others saw problems. Going once at $15, the auctioneer announced. Going twice. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Mom, staying after school to help with homecoming decorations. Can catch a ride with Tommy. Don't worry about pickup. Relief flooded through her. At least she wouldn't have to explain to her son why she was at a foreclosure auction instead of working. Miguel worried enough about their finances without seeing his mother reduced to scavenging for scrap metal. Sold to the lady in the blue jacket for $15. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd done it. For $15, she now owned a piece of machinery that might contain enough salvageable material to solve their immediate crisis. Or she'd just thrown away money they couldn't afford to lose on a pile of worthless junk. She made her way to the payment table, hands trembling slightly as she counted out the bills. The clerk barely looked up as she processed the sale, stamping Elena's receipt with practiced indifference. Pickup is your responsibility. Has to be removed by end of business tomorrow. Elena nodded, already wondering how she'd manage that. The windmill had to weigh several hundred pounds. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Tom Brennan's number. The old farmer owed her a favor from when she'd helped him apply for agricultural energy credits. Maybe he could spare a truck and some time. Elena. Tom's voice was warm despite the static on the line. How you doing, sweetheart? I'm fine, Tom. Listen, I need a favor. Could you help me move something? It's not far, just from the old Whitmore place to my workshop. Course I can. What kind of something are we talking about? Elena looked across the lot at her purchase, now tagged with a bright orange sticker. A windmill, old one from the 40s. Tom's laugh carried genuine affection. Only you would buy a windmill at a foreclosure sale. Planning another restoration project. Something like that. Elena couldn't bring herself to admit the truth, that she was planning to tear it apart for scrap money. Tom had too much respect for old machinery to understand that kind of necessity. I'll be there in an hour with the flatbed. Miguel around to help with the loading. He should be home soon. Tom, I really appreciate this. Don't mention it. Besides, I'm curious to see what you've gotten yourself into this time. Elena ended the call and walked back to examine her purchase more closely. Up close, the windmill was even more impressive than she'd realized. The engineering was sophisticated for its era, with precision-machined components that spoke of quality craftsmanship. Despite decades of weather damage, the basic structure remained sound. She ran her hand along one of the twisted blades, feeling the ghost of motion in the still metal. This machine had once turned mountain wind into useful energy, had stood as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of nature's challenges. Now it was reduced to salvage, its purpose forgotten in the modern world's rush toward newer technologies. A familiar pang of guilt twisted in her stomach. This was what her financial desperation had brought her to, destroying history for quick cash. But Miguel's future mattered more than preserving the past. Her son's brilliance deserved better than being limited by their poverty. She heard Tom's truck before she saw it, the diesel engine growling up the mountain road. Miguel sat in the passenger seat, his backpack slung over one shoulder and excitement written across his 17-year-old features. Even from a distance, Elena could see the moment he spotted the windmill. His posture straightened, his head tilted with the analytical attention he brought to any mechanical challenge. "Mom!" Miguel called out as he jumped down from the truck's cab. "Is this what you bought? This is incredible. Tom emerged more slowly, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. That's a genuine Air Motor 702. Haven't seen one of these in 20 years. Miguel was already circling the windmill, his hands tracing its components with the reverent attention of someone who understood machinery. "Look at this blade design, Mom, and the gear ratio on the transmission housing. This thing was built to run forever." Elena watched her son's enthusiasm with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Miguel had inherited her gift for understanding complex systems, but he'd also inherited her stubborn streak. Once something captured his interest, he pursued it with single-minded determination. "It needs a complete restoration," Miguel continued, kneeling to examine the base mechanism. "But the core components are all here. With the right tools and some time, we could get this running again." "Miguel," Elena said gently, "we bought it for salvage. The copper wiring alone should cover your college application fees." Her son's face fell. "Salvage? Mom, this is a piece of history. Look at the craftsmanship in these gears. You don't find engineering like this anymore." Tom nodded his agreement. "Boy's got a point, Elena. This is museum-quality equipment. Shame to see it scrapped." Elena felt the familiar weight of disappointing her son. "I understand that, but we have practical concerns. Your future is more important than preserving old machinery. What if?" Miguel's voice took on the careful tone he used when proposing something he knew she might reject. "What if I made this my senior project for advanced engineering? Mr. Patterson's been pushing us to find real-world applications for our coursework. I could document the restoration process, maybe even get it running again." "Miguel, we need the money from—" "I know we need money," he interrupted, then caught himself and softened his tone. "I know things are tight, Mum, but what if the restoration makes it worth more than just the salvage value? A working vintage windmill has to be worth something to collectors, right?" Elena looked at her son's hopeful face, then at the windmill that had somehow become the center of their financial crisis and his academic ambition. Tom watched the exchange with the patient understanding of someone who'd seen families navigate hard choices before. "I'll make you a deal," Elena said finally. "You can try restoring it, but if we don't see real progress in 2 weeks, we sell it for parts. Fair enough?" Miguel's grin lit up the cloudy afternoon. "Fair enough. Thank you, Mom." As they loaded the windmill onto Tom's flatbed, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a decision that would change more than their immediate financial situation. Miguel's excitement was infectious, but it also worried her. Her son had always been prone to losing himself in projects that captured his imagination. This windmill might solve their money problems, or it might become another beautiful distraction they couldn't afford. The windmill settled into their backyard workshop an hour later, its metal components gleaming dully in the overhead fluorescent lights. Miguel was already pulling out tools, his face flushed with anticipation. Elena watched him work, remembering her own excitement when she'd first discovered her passion for renewable energy systems. The hope and determination in his eyes reminded her why she'd started her consulting business in the first place, to build something better for the next generation. Maybe, just maybe, this desperate purchase would prove to be worth more than its weight in salvaged copper. Miguel's hands were stained with rust and determination by 7 the next morning. Elena found him in the workshop, already 3 hours into dismantling the windmill with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every bolt and bearing told a story. Coffee steamed from a mug balanced precariously on her workbench, testament to how early her son had started his project. "You know school doesn't start until 8:30, Elena said, pulling her robe tighter against the October chill that seeped through the workshop's thin walls. "I know," Miguel replied without looking up from the gear housing he was examining. "But look at this, Mom. This isn't standard factory work. Someone modified this transmission system after it was built. See these welds here?" Elena moved closer, her engineering background automatically engaging with the technical puzzle her son had uncovered. The welding work was crude but effective, clearly done by someone with practical rather than professional training. Probably a repair job. These old windmills took a beating in mountain weather. Maybe. Miguel's tone suggested he wasn't convinced. But why would you reinforce the housing this way, unless you were planning to run it harder than the original design specifications? Before Elena could respond, she heard Tommy's voice calling from the driveway. Miguel's best friend appeared in the workshop doorway, already shouldering his video camera with the casual expertise of someone who'd been documenting everything interesting that happened in his teenage life. "Dude, you started without me," Tommy said, immediately focused on the partially disassembled windmill. "I thought we were going to film this from the beginning." "I couldn't sleep," Miguel admitted. "This thing is way more complicated than I expected. Tommy, you need to get this modification work on camera. It's not in any of the technical manuals I found online." Tommy Chen had been Miguel's closest friend since elementary school, bound by their shared status as the smartest kids in their respective families and their mutual fascination with how things worked. Where Miguel approached problems with methodical analysis, Tommy brought creative perspective and an eye for the story behind the facts. His dream of becoming a documentary filmmaker meant he saw narrative potential in every situation. "So what's the story here?" Tommy asked, adjusting his camera settings. "Mysterious modifications to a Depression-era windmill? Sounds like the beginning of a good mystery." "That's what I'm hoping to find out," Miguel said. "But first, I need to understand how this thing was supposed to work originally, then figure out what someone changed and why." Elena watched her son and his friend work together, Tommy filming, while Miguel explained each component he removed. Despite her anxiety about their financial situation, she felt a familiar surge of pride at Miguel's intellectual curiosity. Her son had inherited her systematic approach to complex problems, but he'd added his own passion for historical context that she'd never possessed. "The blade design is really sophisticated for 1940s technology," Miguel continued, speaking partly to Tommy's camera and partly to himself. "The pitch angle is adjustable, which means someone could optimize it for different wind conditions. That takes real understanding of aerodynamics." "Who would have had that kind of knowledge back then?" Tommy asked. "Engineers, maybe some aircraft mechanics from the war. But this is rural Colorado in the 30s and 40s. Not exactly a hotbed of advanced engineering." Elena pulled up a stool and settled in to watch the process more carefully. Miguel had spread the windmill components across 2 workbenches, organizing them with the same precision she brought to her renewable energy system designs. Each part was labeled and photographed before removal, creating a detailed record of the original assembly. "You're treating this like an archaeological dig," she observed. "In a way, that's exactly what it is," Miguel replied. "This machine represents someone's solution to a specific problem at a specific time. Understanding that solution might tell us something important about the person who built it." Tommy lowered his camera. "You really think there's a story here worth telling?" "I think every old machine has a story," Miguel said. "The question is whether we're smart enough to read the clues." As the morning progressed, Elena found herself drawn deeper into the restoration process, despite her practical concerns about time and money. Miguel's enthusiasm was infectious, but more than that, his methodical approach reminded her why she'd fallen in love with engineering in the first place. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a broken system and understanding it well enough to make it work again. "Look at this," Miguel said suddenly, his voice sharp with excitement. He was examining the wooden housing that surrounded the gear mechanism, running his fingers along what looked like scratches in the weathered surface. "These aren't just random marks. Someone carved something here." Elena and Tommy both leaned in to look. The marks were faint, worn by decades of weather, but they formed recognizable letters. J.W. for the journey 1938. "J.W., Tommy repeated. "Those could be someone's initials." 1938, Elena added. "That would be right around when this windmill was manufactured." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miguel was already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. If this was built on the Whitmore property, then JW might be someone from that family. Let me see what I can find about the ownership history. Miguel, Elena said gently, remember our deal. 2 weeks to show real progress or we sell it for parts. Her son looked up from his phone, and Elena was surprised by the intensity in his expression. Mom, I think this is going to be worth more than just salvage. Look at the quality of this work, the modifications, the personal touches. This isn't just a machine, it's someone's legacy. Elena felt a familiar tug between her practical concerns and her son's idealistic passion. Miguel had always been drawn to projects that captured his imagination completely, sometimes at the expense of practical considerations. She'd spent years trying to balance encouraging his intellectual curiosity with keeping him grounded in reality. What if we compromise? She suggested. You continue the restoration, but we also research what a working vintage windmill might actually sell for. That way, we have realistic expectations about what we're investing our time in. Fair enough, Miguel agreed. But I want to understand who JW was and why they modified this machine. That has to be part of the story. Tommy raised his camera again. And I want to document the whole investigation. If there's a mystery here, people will want to see how we solve it. Elena nodded. Though she couldn't shake her anxiety about the time and energy her son was investing in what might ultimately prove to be an expensive distraction. Still, watching Miguel work reminded her of her own early passion for renewable energy, the excitement of seeing potential in systems others overlooked. Just promise me you won't let this project interfere with your regular schoolwork, she said. Your grades are too important to risk, especially with college applications due soon. I promise, Miguel replied, already turning back to the windmill components. Besides, Mr. Patterson said this kind of hands-on engineering work would actually strengthen my college applications. Real-world problem-solving is exactly what admissions committees want to see. As Elena headed back to the house to prepare for her own workday, she could hear Miguel and Tommy discussing their research strategy. Her son's excitement was unmistakable, and despite her practical concerns, she found herself hoping that his optimism about the project's potential might prove justified. The morning light streaming through the workshop windows illuminated the organized chaos of the restoration project. Metal components arranged with scientific precision, Tommy's camera documenting every detail, and Miguel's notebook already filling with observations and theories. It looked like the beginning of something significant, though Elena couldn't yet imagine just how dramatically this old windmill would change their lives. 3 days later, Miguel had made enough progress on the windmill restoration to clear away decades of accumulated grime from the gear housing. The ancient grease had hardened into a black, tar-like substance that required careful scraping with dental picks, a technique he'd learned from watching archaeological documentaries. Tommy filmed the painstaking process, occasionally offering commentary that Miguel would later edit into his documentary project. This is like performing surgery on a machine, Miguel said, his voice muffled by the dust mask Elena had insisted he wear. Every layer of corrosion might be hiding something important underneath. The workshop had taken on the organized chaos of a serious engineering project. Elena's neat pegboard tool arrangement now competed with Miguel's carefully labeled containers of bolts, washers, and mechanical fragments. His notebook had grown thick with sketches, measurements, and theories about the windmill's original purpose and subsequent modifications. Elena checked on his progress between her own work calls, trying to drum up new clients for her struggling renewable energy consulting business. The irony wasn't lost on her that while she was restoring a Depression-era wind machine, she couldn't convince modern Colorado ranchers to invest in contemporary wind power systems. "How's it going?" she asked, settling onto her workshop stool with a cup of coffee that had grown cold during her latest unsuccessful sales call. "I think I figured out why someone modified the gear ratio," Miguel replied, not looking up from his delicate scraping work. The original design was optimized for consistent prairie winds, but mountain conditions are completely different. Gusty, unpredictable. Someone who understood the local weather patterns redesigned this system to handle variable wind speeds. Tommy lowered his camera. So JW was some kind of engineer, or maybe just someone who understood machines really well, Miguel said. A lot of practical engineers during the Depression were self-taught. They had to be. Formal engineering education was expensive, and most people were just trying to survive. Elena watched her son work with the same meticulous attention she brought to her own projects. Despite her anxiety about their financial situation, she felt proud of Miguel's systematic approach to the restoration. He'd inherited her analytical mind, but he'd developed his own passion for understanding historical context. "What's this section here?" Miguel muttered, more to himself than to his audience. He was working on the central gear housing, the heart of the windmill's mechanical system. The metal's different, newer. Elena leaned closer. Even to her trained eye, the difference was subtle, a slight variation in the steel's color and texture that suggested it had been added or replaced long after the windmill's original construction. Miguel picked up a small flashlight and peered into the gap he'd created by removing the corroded outer casing. "There's something weird about the spacing here, like there's more room than there should be for just the gear mechanism." "What do you mean?" Tommy asked, raising his camera again. "Well, look," Miguel said, using his dental pick to trace the outline of the gear housing. "The external dimensions don't match the internal space requirements for the mechanical components. There's at least 6 inches of dead space that doesn't serve any obvious mechanical purpose." Elena's engineering instincts kicked in. Empty space in mechanical design was usually either an error or intentional storage. Given the quality of the windmill's construction, an error seemed unlikely. "Could it be structural?" she suggested. "Maybe they needed the extra material for strength in high winds." Miguel shook his head. "The stress patterns don't support that theory. This extra space isn't contributing to the structural integrity of the system." He worked for another 20 minutes, carefully removing more of the hardened grease and corrosion. Tommy documented the process while Elena found herself drawn into the puzzle despite her practical concerns about time and money. "Wait," Miguel said suddenly, his voice sharp with excitement. "I think I found something." He was probing with his flashlight into a gap near the base of the gear housing. "There's a seam here that doesn't match the welding patterns elsewhere. It looks almost like—" Miguel grabbed a screwdriver and began working carefully along the seam. After several minutes of patient effort, a section of the metal housing shifted slightly. "It's a panel," he breathed. "A hidden panel." Elena and Tommy both moved closer as Miguel worked to open what appeared to be a concealed compartment. The metal had corroded at the edges, making it difficult to move, but Miguel's persistence finally paid off. With a grinding sound of protesting metal, a rectangular section swung open on hidden hinges. Inside the compartment, wrapped in what looked like oiled leather, sat a small pouch and a book-sized package. For a moment, none of them spoke. The discovery was so unexpected, so obviously intentional, that it transformed their understanding of the windmill entirely. This wasn't just a machine, it was a hiding place. "Are you getting this?" Miguel asked Tommy, who was already filming. "Every second," Tommy replied, his voice unusually quiet. Miguel carefully lifted out the leather pouch first. It was heavier than expected, and when he opened it, the contents took their collective breath away. Gold coins, dozens of them, gleamed dully in the workshop's fluorescent lighting. Each coin was clearly old, bearing dates from the 1920s and 1930s. "Those are real," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her engineering background included enough materials knowledge to recognize genuine gold when she saw it. Miguel set the pouch aside with trembling hands and reached for the book-shaped package. The leather wrapping had protected its contents better than the coins. Inside was a journal, its leather binding cracked with age but still intact. Miguel opened it carefully to the first page. In careful handwriting, someone had written, "Property of Joseph Whitmore, Cedar Ridge, Colorado." For those who come after, may you understand what we tried to do. Joseph Whitmore, Elena repeated. J.W. Miguel turned to the next page and began reading aloud. March 15th, 1938. The Hendersons arrived today, 3 children and a baby. Lost their farm in Kansas to the dust storms. Marie is sick, probably pneumonia. They need a place to rest before continuing west to California. Elena felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as she began to understand what they'd discovered. This wasn't just treasure. It was historical evidence of something much more significant. Miguel continued reading. April 2nd, 1938. The Kowalski family moved on this morning. Left $20 in gold as payment for food and shelter. I tried to refuse it, but Stan insisted. Said it was all he had left of his father's inheritance, and he wanted it to help the next family. He was helping Dust Bowl refugees, Tommy said, his camera still rolling. This was some kind of way station. Elena's mind raced with the implications. The gold wasn't just valuable, it represented the desperate contributions of families who had nothing left except their hope for a better future. And now, through a $15 purchase at a foreclosure auction, this legacy had fallen into their hands. Keep reading, she said, though her voice felt distant to her own ears. Miguel turned more pages, revealing entry after entry, documenting families helped, supplies provided, and small amounts of gold left as payment or gratitude. The journal painted a picture of Joseph Whitmore as someone who had used his property and resources to help desperate people during one of America's most difficult economic periods. There must be thousands of dollars worth of gold here, Miguel said, weighing the leather pouch in his hand. Elena stared at the treasure and the journal, understanding that her son's curiosity had led them into something far more complex than a simple restoration project. This discovery would change their lives, but it would also raise questions about ownership, moral responsibility, and what they owed to the memory of Joseph Whitmore and the families he'd helped. The workshop fell silent except for the mountain wind rattling the windows. Outside, the world continued unchanged. But inside, Elena and Miguel faced the realization that their desperate $15 gamble had uncovered a piece of history that belonged to much more than just them. Elena spent the next morning in the Cedar Ridge Public Library, a converted Victorian house where the smell of old books mixed with the sharp scent of fresh coffee from the librarian's perpetually brewing pot. She'd left Miguel at home with strict instructions to secure the treasure and journal while she researched their legal obligations. The weight of what they'd discovered pressed on her shoulders like a physical burden. The library's single computer terminal moved at the pace of dial-up internet, forcing Elena to wait precious minutes between searches. She'd managed to find basic information about treasure trove laws in Colorado, but the legal language was dense and contradictory. What she understood so far wasn't encouraging. Their claim to the gold was far from certain. "Excuse me," a sharp voice said behind her. "Are you Elena Vasquez?" Elena turned to find a woman in her late 80s, watching her with keen eyes that missed nothing. Despite her age, the woman carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to getting answers. "Yes, I am." "And you are?" "Dorothy Henley. People call me Dot. I was the head librarian here for 37 years before I retired." The woman's gaze swept over Elena's legal research materials. "Word travels fast in a small town. Heard your boy found something interesting in that old windmill." Elena's stomach clenched. She'd hoped to keep their discovery quiet until they understood their legal position better. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but I've heard enough," Dot interrupted, pulling up a chair without invitation. "Question is, what do you know about Joseph Whitmore?" The directness of the question caught Elena off guard. "Only what we found in his journal. He helped families during the Dust Bowl." Dot's expression softened slightly. "Joseph was a good man in bad times. Lost his wife in the 1918 flu pandemic, never remarried. Devoted his life to helping folks who had nowhere else to turn." She paused, studying Elena's face. "But he wasn't working alone." Elena set down her pen. "What do you mean?" "There were others. Families throughout the valley who opened their doors shared what little they had. Joseph coordinated it, kept the records, made sure nobody fell through the cracks. Dot's voice carried the weight of personal memory. My own family took in 3 different groups. The Hendersons, the Kowalskis, others whose names I've forgotten. You remember the actual families mentioned in the journal? Child, I lived through those times. The dust storms, the hunger, the desperation. People don't forget watching neighbors help neighbors survive. Dot leaned forward. What I want to know is what you plan to do with what you found. Elena felt the moral complexity of their situation crystallizing. I don't know yet. We're still trying to understand our legal obligations. Legal obligations? Dot's tone suggested what she thought of that approach. Let me ask you something different. What do you think Joseph would have wanted? Before Elena could answer, Miguel appeared in the library doorway, his face flushed with excitement and anxiety. Mom, we need to go, now. Elena gathered her papers quickly, sensing urgency in her son's voice. Mrs. Henley, I'd like to continue this conversation. You know where to find me, Dot replied, but her sharp eyes were already studying Miguel's agitated state. Outside the library, Miguel grabbed his mother's arm. Tommy accidentally showed the video footage to some kids at school. Now everyone's talking about it. And there's more. What kind of more? Sheriff Santos called. She wants to meet with us this afternoon. Said it's about items of potential historical significance. Miguel's voice cracked with worry. Mom, what if we're in trouble? What if we weren't supposed to find this stuff? Elena felt the control she'd maintained slipping away. Their quiet discovery was becoming public knowledge, which meant complications she wasn't prepared to handle. Let's go home. We need to figure out our next steps. As they drove through Cedar Ridge's main street, Elena noticed people turning to look at their car with more interest than usual. The invisible weight of small-town gossip settled around them like mountain fog. Back at the house, Tommy was waiting with his camera and a guilty expression. I'm really sorry, Mr. V. I was just showing some friends the restoration footage, and when the treasure part came up, everyone went crazy. I tried to make them promise to keep it secret, but secrets don't stay secret in Cedar Ridge, Elena finished. She'd grown up in small towns before moving to Colorado. She understood how quickly private matters became community property. Miguel paced the workshop, his earlier excitement replaced by anxiety. What are we going to do? If everyone knows, how do we research this properly? How do we figure out what's right? Elena looked at the windmill components still scattered across her workbenches, then at the carefully secured treasure and journal. 3 days ago, their biggest worry had been Miguel's college application fees. Now they were custodians of a piece of American history, and everyone in town apparently had an opinion about what they should do with it. We tell the truth, she said finally, to Sheriff Santos, to anyone who asks. We explain what we found and what we've learned so far. Then we let the proper authorities help us figure out our obligations. Miguel stopped pacing. What if the proper authorities take everything away? What if we end up with nothing after all this? Elena felt the familiar tension between her son's idealistic hopes and the harsh realities of legal systems. Then at least we'll know we did the right thing. Miguel, this treasure represents something bigger than our financial problems. Those gold coins came from families who had lost everything but still found ways to help others. We have to honor that legacy. Tommy lowered his camera. So what happens to my documentary? That depends, Elena said, on whether the story we're documenting is about finding treasure or about understanding our responsibility to preserve history. As the afternoon light faded, Elena prepared for Sheriff Santos's visit while wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. She'd bought a broken windmill for $15, hoping to salvage enough copper to pay for her son's future. Instead, she'd inherited the moral complexity of decisions made by desperate people in desperate times. The true test of their character was just beginning. Sheriff Maria Santos arrived at exactly 3 o'clock, her patrol car crunching over the gravel driveway with deliberate precision. Elena watched from the kitchen window as the sheriff emerged, a woman in her mid-40s, with the careful bearing of someone who, understood that every conversation in a small town carried multiple layers of meaning. Elena met her at the front door, Miguel hovering anxiously behind her. "Sheriff Santos, thank you for coming." "Elena, Miguel." Maria's tone was professional but not unfriendly. "I understand you've made quite a discovery." They settled in the living room, the afternoon light casting long shadows across Elena's carefully maintained but increasingly shabby furniture. Maria declined coffee, but accepted Elena's offer to examine the treasure and journal, which they'd laid out on the dining room table like evidence at a crime scene. "This is Joseph Whitmore's handwriting," Maria said after examining the journal's first few entries. "I've seen his signature on old property documents at the courthouse." She looked up at Elena. "What's your understanding of the legal situation here?" Elena had prepared for this question during her morning research. "From what I can determine, Colorado treasure trove law is complicated. Since I purchased the Windmill legally at a public auction, I believe we have a legitimate claim to its contents. But I also understand that if these items have significant historical value, there might be other considerations." Maria nodded approvingly. "That's a fair assessment. The situation becomes more complex when we consider that some parties might dispute your claim based on the original property ownership." Before Elena could ask what that meant, the sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Through the window, Elena saw a black SUV parking behind the sheriff's patrol car. A man in his 30s emerged, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that announced both wealth and authority. "That would be James Whitmore," Maria said, following Elena's gaze. "Joseph's grandson. He called me this morning after hearing about your discovery." Elena felt Miguel tense beside her. The theoretical legal complications were about to become very real and very personal. James Whitmore knocked with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. When Elena answered, she found herself face to face with a man who radiated the controlled anger of someone who believed he'd been cheated. "Miss Vasquez," he said without preamble, "I'm James Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Elena stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware that this confrontation would determine everything that followed. "Mr. Whitmore, please come in. Sheriff Santos is here as well." James nodded curtly at Maria, then focused his attention on Elena with laser intensity. "I'll get straight to the point. Whatever you found in that windmill came from my grandfather's property. The fact that you bought the windmill at auction doesn't give you rights to family heirlooms that were hidden before the foreclosure." "With respect," Elena replied, forcing her voice to remain steady, "the windmill and its contents were part of the foreclosure sale. I purchased it legally." James pulled documents from his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "These are copies of my grandfather's will and property records. Joseph Whitmore never intended for family assets to be sold at public auction. The foreclosure was supposed to cover the property's debts, not liquidate personal belongings." Miguel stepped forward, his young voice carrying surprising authority. "Have you read your grandfather's journal, Mr. Whitmore? Do you understand what he was doing with this treasure?" James's expression hardened. "What my grandfather did or didn't do doesn't change the fact that this property belongs to the Whitmore family. We lost our land in 2008 because of circumstances beyond our control. I've spent 15 years trying to recover what my family built over generations." Elena watched the pain flash across James's features and realized this wasn't just about greed. It was about legacy, about a man trying to reclaim something precious that had been taken from his family. But that didn't change her own family's desperate circumstances or the legal reality of their purchase. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I understand this is emotional for you. But Miguel and I discovered these items through legitimate restoration work on property we legally own." "Legally own?" James's voice rose. "You paid $15 for a piece of farm equipment at a foreclosure sale. You didn't buy the family history, the personal items, or the legacy that went with it." Sheriff Santos raised her hand for quiet. "Let's all take a step back. James, what exactly are you proposing?" James set his briefcase on Elena's coffee table with the gesture of someone making a business presentation. I'm prepared to compensate Ms. Vasquez for her $15 investment and any time spent on restoration. In return, I want everything found in that windmill returned to where it belongs, with the Whitmore family. Miguel's face flushed with indignation. You can't just buy back history because you have more money than we do. Your grandfather didn't hide this treasure for your family. He hid it to help people who had nothing. People like those families he wrote about in his journal. You're 17 years old, James snapped. You don't understand the complexities of property law or family obligations. Elena felt her protective instincts flare. Don't speak to my son that way. Miguel has spent more time studying your grandfather's work than you apparently have. He understands better than anyone what Joseph was trying to accomplish. James turned his attention back to Elena, his voice dropping to a more controlled but no less threatening tone. Ms. Vasquez, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but if you force me to pursue this through legal channels, you'll face expenses that will far exceed whatever you think that treasure is worth. I have resources you don't have, and I'm prepared to use them. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. Elena understood exactly what James was telling her, that even if she was legally right, she couldn't afford to prove it in court. The very financial desperation that had driven her to the foreclosure auction now made her vulnerable to someone with the resources to overwhelm her with legal costs. Sheriff Santos cleared her throat. James, I appreciate your position, but threats aren't going to resolve this situation constructively. It's not a threat, James replied. It's a practical reality. Ms. Vasquez can't afford a prolonged legal battle over treasure that belongs to my family. I'm offering her a way out that compensates her for her time and trouble. Elena looked at her son, seeing the idealistic outrage in his eyes, then at Sheriff Santos, who was clearly trying to find a diplomatic solution to an increasingly volatile situation. The treasure that had seemed like salvation 3 days ago now felt like a burden that might destroy everything they'd tried to build. I need time to consider this, Elena said finally. James nodded curtly. You have 48 hours. After that, I file papers to claim the treasure and seek damages for its wrongful retention. He gathered his documents and stood. Sheriff Santos, I trust you'll ensure the treasure remains secure until this matter is resolved. After James left, the living room felt like a battlefield after the shooting had stopped. Miguel slumped in his chair, his earlier excitement replaced by defeated confusion. Sheriff Santos studied her notes with the expression of someone who'd seen too many similar disputes. What are our real options? Elena asked. Maria chose her words carefully. Legally, you have a strong position, but James is right about the practical realities. This kind of dispute can take years and cost more than most people can afford. She paused. There might be other approaches to consider. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She'd bought a windmill, hoping to salvage enough copper to pay for her son's future. Instead, she'd inherited a moral and legal puzzle that threatened to consume everything they had left. The treasure glittered on her dining room table, beautiful and terrible in its complexity. Somewhere in those gold coins lay the contributions of desperate families who had trusted Joseph Whitmore to help them survive. Now Elena had to decide what she owed to their memory, to her son's future, and to her own conscience. That evening, Miguel refused to give up. While Elena paced the kitchen wrestling with James Whitmore's ultimatum, her son had transformed their dining room into a research center. Tommy's laptop displayed genealogy websites alongside digitized newspaper archives, while Joseph's journal lay open beside neat stacks of printed documents. I found something, Miguel announced, his voice cutting through Elena's anxious thoughts. Professor Sarah Blackwood at Colorado State University. She's written 3 papers on Depression-era migration patterns in rural Colorado. Elena looked up from the legal papers she'd been studying. What does that have to do with our situation? Everything, maybe. Miguel turned his laptop screen toward her. Look at her research focus. Underground networks and informal support systems during the Dust Bowl era. She might be able to verify what Grandfather Joseph was doing, Give us academic backing for our claims about the treasure's historical significance." Tommy looked up from Joseph's journal, which he'd been reading with increasing amazement. This entry from June 1938 mentions the Colorado Freedom Trail. That sounds like an organized network, not just one guy helping random families. Elena felt a spark of hope. If Miguel was right, if Joseph's work was part of something larger and historically significant, it might change their legal position. More importantly, it might provide moral clarity about what they should do with the treasure. "Call her," Elena said, "tonight. If this professor can help us understand the bigger picture, we need to know before James's deadline." Miguel was already dialing. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, slightly breathless. "Professor Blackwood, this is Miguel Vasquez calling from Cedar Ridge, Colorado. I know this is unusual, but we've discovered something that might relate to your research on Depression-era support networks." Elena watched her son explain their situation with impressive clarity, describing the windmill, the hidden compartment, and Joseph's journal entries about helping displaced families. Tommy filmed the conversation while Elena found herself holding her breath. "You found what?" Professor Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "Order. A complete journal documenting way station operations. Mr. Vasquez, what you're describing could be the missing piece of research I've been pursuing for 5 years. Miguel's eyes lit up. "So you know about networks like this?" "Know about them. I've been trying to prove they existed. Most of the evidence was destroyed or lost over time. People were deliberately secretive. They were operating outside official channels, sometimes in violation of local ordinances about transient assistance." Elena leaned closer to the phone. "Professor, this is Elena Vasquez, Miguel's mother. We're facing a legal challenge to our claim on these artifacts. Would your research support their historical significance?" "Mrs. Vasquez, if what your son is describing is authentic, you found documentation of one of the most important humanitarian efforts in Colorado history. These informal networks saved thousands of families during the worst years of the Depression." Elena felt her resolve strengthening. "How quickly could you examine our evidence?" "I can be there tomorrow morning." This discovery is too important to handle over the phone. Professor Blackwood's academic excitement was infectious. "Mr. Vasquez, please tell me you've documented everything carefully." Tommy grinned and held up his camera. "We've got hours of footage, Professor. Every step of the discovery process." After ending the call, the dining room buzzed with renewed energy. Miguel returned to the journal with fresh purpose, while Tommy organized his video files for Professor Blackwood's review. Elena watched her son work and felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. "Miguel, even if Professor Blackwood confirms the historical significance, we still face the practical problem James raised. We can't afford a prolonged legal battle." Her son looked up from the journal, his expression more mature than his 17 years should allow. "Mom, what if being right is more important than being able to afford proving it?" Elena felt the weight of that question. Her own parents had immigrated to this country with nothing but determination and the belief that doing right would somehow lead to a better life. But she'd also learned that idealism without resources often led to bitter disappointment. "That's a luxury we might not be able to afford," she said gently. Miguel turned to a page near the middle of Joseph's journal. "Listen to this entry from September 1938. The Yamamoto family brought news from California. The promised work isn't there. Thousands of families living in camps, competing for jobs that don't exist. But they're not turning back. They say hope is the only thing they have left." He looked up at his mother. "Those families didn't have resources either, Mom. They just had the belief that someone would help them do what was right. That's exactly what Grandfather Joseph was. Someone who helped people do what was right, even when it was difficult." Tommy lowered his camera. "Miguel's got a point, Mrs. V. Maybe this isn't just about legal ownership. Maybe it's about continuing what Joseph started." D. Elena stared at the gold coins scattered across her dining room table, each one representing a family's desperate contribution to their own survival and the survival of others. She thought about her own desperation at the foreclosure auction, how she'd bid $15 on a broken windmill because she had nowhere else to turn. "Professor Blackwood arrives tomorrow morning," she said finally. "We'll see what she says about the historical significance. Then we'll decide how to respond to James." Miguel nodded, already turning back to the journal. "I want to map out all the families mentioned, cross-reference them with historical records. If we're going to fight for this, we need to understand exactly what we're fighting for." As Elena prepared for bed that night, she realized that Miguel's research had transformed their situation from a simple property dispute into something much larger. They weren't just defending their claim to treasure, they were defending the memory of families who had lost everything but still found ways to help each other survive. The question was whether that moral authority would be enough to overcome James Whitmore's legal and financial advantages. Professor Sarah Blackwood arrived at 8 the next morning, her compact car loaded with archival boxes and laptop equipment that transformed Elena's dining room into a makeshift historical laboratory. She was younger than Elena had expected, early 40s with prematurely grey hair and the intense focus of someone who'd spent years chasing elusive historical truths. "This is extraordinary," Professor Blackwood murmured, photographing each page of Joseph's journal with meticulous care. "The level of detail, the geographic scope, this documents a network that extended from Kansas to California, with at least 15 documented way station properties in Colorado alone." Miguel hovered nearby, his notebook filled with questions he'd prepared during the sleepless night. "Professor, how significant would this evidence be historically?" "It is significant enough to rewrite our understanding of Depression-era humanitarian efforts," she replied, without looking up from the journal. "Most academic work on this period focuses on government programs, the CCC, WPA, federal relief efforts. This shows how ordinary people created their own support systems when official help wasn't enough." Elena watched the professor work while wrestling with her own mounting anxiety. James Whitmore's deadline was approaching, and she still hadn't decided how to respond to his ultimatum. The historical validation was gratifying, but it didn't solve their practical problems. "Professor," Elena interrupted, "we're facing a legal challenge from the original property owner's family. Would the historical significance of these artifacts affect our legal position?" Professor Blackwood finally looked up, her expression serious. "That's complicated. Historical significance might support arguments for public interest or museum acquisition, but it doesn't automatically override property claims." She paused, studying Elena's face. "However, there's something else you should know." She opened one of her archival boxes and pulled out a manila folder. "Yesterday evening, after Miguel's call, I contacted colleagues who specialize in Depression-era banking records. Some of the coin dates and mint marks you described match those from an unsolved bank robbery in Pueblo, Colorado, in 1937. Elena felt her stomach drop. "Bank robbery?" "The Farmers' First Bank of Pueblo was robbed on November 15, 1937. 3 men made off with approximately $8,000 in gold coins, a substantial sum at the time. The case was never solved, but the stolen coins were catalogued by serial numbers and mint marks." Miguel's face went pale. "Are you saying our treasure might be stolen money?" "I'm saying some of it might be," Professor Blackwood replied carefully. "The good news is that the statute of limitations on the original theft has long expired. The bad news is that this complicates the moral dimension of your situation considerably." Elena sank into her chair, feeling the weight of another layer of complexity settle on their already difficult situation. "So we might be holding money that was stolen from a bank, then hidden by families who thought they were making legitimate payments for help." "That's one possibility," the professor confirmed. "Another is that Joseph or someone in his network knowingly accepted stolen money to fund their humanitarian work. A third possibility is that the families who contributed these coins had no idea of their origins. They might have received them in legitimate transactions from people who'd unknowingly laundered the stolen money. Tommy, who'd been filming the entire conversation, lowered his camera. So we have treasure that might be stolen, claimed by families who might not have rightful ownership, hidden by someone who might have been accepting criminal money to do humanitarian work. "Welcome to historical research," Professor Blackwood said with grim humor. "Real history is never as clean as textbooks make it seem." Elena stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had seemed like a refuge when she'd first moved to Cedar Ridge. Now they felt like barriers, trapping her in a situation with no clear moral path forward. "What would you do?" she asked the professor. "If you were in our position?" Professor Blackwood considered the question carefully. "As a historian, I'd want to see these artifacts preserved and studied, regardless of their legal ownership. As someone who understands financial pressure, I'd recognize that idealism doesn't pay bills or send kids to college." She paused. "But as someone who spent years studying how ordinary people faced impossible choices during the Depression, I'd probably ask myself what Joseph Whitmore would have done." Miguel opened the journal to a page he'd marked with a yellow sticky note. "Actually, I think I found the answer to that." He began reading. December 3rd, 1938. Young Tom Henderson returned from California today. Says there's work in the shipyards for anyone willing to learn. He brought $50 to repay what we gave his family last spring. I tried to refuse it, but he insisted. Said his father taught him that debts of kindness must be honored. I'll use it to help the next family that comes through. Elena felt something shift in her understanding. He reinvested everything back into helping others. "That's not all," Miguel continued, turning to another marked page. January 20th, 1939, Sheriff Kowalski visited today, asking questions about the Pueblo bank matter. I told him the truth. The desperate families sometimes carry complicated money, and our job isn't to investigate everyone's history, but to help them survive. He seemed to understand. Some questions are more important than others. Professor Blackwood straightened. "Sheriff Kowalski? That name appears in my research on law enforcement cooperation with informal relief networks. He was known for looking the other way when humanitarian efforts bent official rules." Elena returned to her chair, feeling the pieces of a larger picture beginning to form. "So Joseph knew some of the money might be problematic, but he decided helping families was more important than perfect legal compliance." "It appears that way," Professor Blackwood confirmed. "Which raises the question, what's more important to you? Perfect legal clarity or honoring the spirit of what Joseph was trying to accomplish?" Before Elena could answer, they heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, she saw James Whitmore approaching the house, several hours ahead of his stated deadline. This time he wasn't alone. An older woman walked beside him, moving slowly but with unmistakable determination. "That's Ruth Whitmore," Professor Blackwood said, recognizing the woman from historical photographs. James's mother? She would have known Joseph personally. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Ruth Whitmore's arrival could change everything. She was the one person still alive who might be able to resolve the questions about Joseph's intentions and the treasure's rightful purpose. Miguel gathered the journal and coins, securing them carefully while Professor Blackwood organized her research materials. Tommy raised his camera, understanding instinctively that whatever happened next would be crucial to their story. Elena opened the door before James could knock, finding herself face to face with the woman whose family's legacy had been the source of so much moral complexity. Ruth Whitmore studied Elena with sharp eyes that missed nothing, then spoke in a voice that carried decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Mrs. Vasquez, I believe it's time we had a conversation about what my father-in-law really intended when he hid that treasure, and what he would expect you to do with it now." Elena stepped aside to let both Whitmores enter, understanding that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the treasure, but how she and Miguel would define their own moral compass in the face of impossible choices. The dining room fell silent As Ruth Whitmore examined the gold coins and journal that had divided her family from Elena's, knowing that the truth she'd carried for decades might finally need to be shared. Ruth Whitmore settled into Elena's dining room chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones carried the weight of 86 years and too many secrets. She picked up one of the gold coins, turning it over in her weathered fingers with the familiarity of someone who'd handled it before. "James doesn't know what I'm about to tell you," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd decided that truth mattered more than family comfort. "My husband made me promise never to speak of it. Said it would only bring shame to the family name." James shifted uncomfortably beside his mother. "Mother, we don't need to air family business in front of strangers." "Strangers?" Ruth's sharp eyes fixed on her son. "These people have spent more time understanding your great-grandfather's work than you ever have." She turned back to Elena. "Mrs. Vasquez, what has that journal told you about Joseph's intentions?" Elena glanced at Miguel, who nodded encouragingly. "It shows that he helped displaced families during the Depression, using his property as a way station for people traveling west. The gold appears to be contributions from families he helped, payment for food and shelter." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's the truth, but not the whole truth." She reached into her purse and withdrew a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. "Joseph left this for whoever found his treasure. My husband was supposed to give it to the authorities after Joseph's death in 1947, but he was too ashamed of what it contained." Professor Blackwood leaned forward, her historian's instincts fully engaged. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask what your husband was ashamed of?" "The fact that his father was a better man than he was," Ruth replied with surprising bitterness. She broke the wax seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in Joseph's careful handwriting. "Shall I read it, or would you prefer to discover his words for yourselves?" Elena felt Miguel tense beside her. "Please, read it." Ruth's voice took on the cadence of someone reading words she'd memorized through years of secret contemplation. "To whoever discovers this cache, the gold you have found represents the contributions of 347 families who passed through my property between 1935 and 1943. Some gave what little they had in gratitude for shelter and food. Others left money as insurance against future need, hoping they might return if their journey west failed them." She paused, looking directly at James. "But your great-grandfather knew some of the money was problematic, didn't he, Mother?" Ruth continued reading. "I knew that some coins came from desperate acts, men who robbed banks to feed their children, women who sold belongings that weren't rightfully theirs, families who carried money they'd found abandoned on failed farms. I chose to help them anyway, because hunger and homelessness were greater sins than the complicated money they carried." Professor Blackwood made a small sound of understanding. "So he was aware of the bank robbery connection." "There's more," Ruth said. "Joseph writes, this gold is not meant to enrich anyone's heirs. It exists to continue the work of helping displaced families find their way to better lives. Whoever finds it inherits not wealth, but responsibility. Use it to help those who have nowhere else to turn, as I tried to help those who came to me." And the dining room fell absolutely silent. Elena stared at the gold coins, understanding finally that they weren't treasure in any conventional sense. They were a trust, a responsibility passed down through generations. James's face had gone pale. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Ruth's expression softened slightly toward her son. "Because you were so angry about losing the ranch, so focused on reclaiming what you thought belonged to us. I was afraid you'd see this as validation of your right to the money, when Joseph's letter makes it clear that family ownership was never his intention." Miguel spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "So we're not just fighting over who owns the treasure. We're deciding whether to honor Joseph's wishes about how it should be used." "Exactly," Ruth confirmed. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the journal. "Mrs. Vasquez, your son has shown more understanding of Joseph's mission in 1 week than my family has demonstrated in 70 years. Elena felt the moral weight of the situation settle on her shoulders with crushing clarity. The gold wasn't theirs to keep or James's to reclaim. It belonged to the future families who would need help finding their way to better lives. "Mrs. Whitmore," Elena said slowly, "what do you think Joseph would want us to do?" Ruth smiled for the first time since entering the house. "I think he'd want you to do exactly what you're doing, asking the right questions instead of just assuming you deserve the easy answers." Professor Blackwood had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you be willing to make this letter part of the official historical record? It's crucial documentation of Depression-era humanitarian networks." "I'd be honored to," Ruth replied. "It's time these secrets stopped being secrets." James had been quiet during his mother's revelations, but now he spoke with obvious difficulty. "I don't understand. If great-grandfather intended the money to help people, why did our family lose the ranch? Why didn't he use this gold to save the property?" Ruth's expression grew sad. "Because Joseph understood something your father and grandfather never learned, that helping others was more important than preserving family wealth. He chose to honor his mission rather than secure his legacy." Elena watched James process this information, seeing the conflict between his desire to reclaim family property and his growing understanding of what that property had actually represented to his great-grandfather. Tommy, who had been filming everything, finally spoke. "So what happens now? We know what Joseph wanted, but we still have to decide how to make it happen in the real world." Elena looked around the room at the faces watching her. Miguel, with his idealistic hope. James, with his complicated grief. Ruth, with her relieved confession. Professor Blackwood, with her academic fascination. And Tommy, with his documentarian's eye for human truth. "We honor Joseph's wishes," she said finally. "But we do it in a way that brings our community together instead of tearing it apart." Ruth nodded approvingly. "That sounds like something Joseph would have supported. He always believed that helping people was a community responsibility, not an individual burden." James stared at the gold coins for a long moment, then looked at his mother. "You really think great-grandfather would disapprove of us reclaiming this money?" "I think your great-grandfather would be proud of you for asking that question," Ruth replied gently. "And I think he'd be even prouder if you found a way to continue his work instead of just inheriting his wealth." Elena felt something shift in the room's dynamic. The adversarial tension between families was transforming into something more collaborative and hopeful. Miguel opened Joseph's journal to a page near the end. "There's one more entry I want to read. From December 1943, the war has changed everything. Families are moving for different reasons now, following work in defense plants, escaping rationing restrictions, searching for brothers and sons who never came home. But the need for way station help continues. Perhaps it always will. I pray that someone will understand this mission well enough to continue it when I'm gone." Elena looked at Miguel, then at James, then at Ruth. "I think it's time we figured out how to answer that prayer." The treasure still glittered on her dining room table, but it no longer looked like salvation or burden. It looked like possibility, the raw material for building something that could honor both Joseph's memory and the needs of families who would always be looking for help, finding their way to better lives. 2 weeks later, Cedar Ridge's community center buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt since the annual Harvest Festival. Elena stood at the front of the packed room, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. Miguel sat in the front row beside Tommy, whose camera captured everything for the documentary that had evolved into something far more significant than a high school project. Sheriff Maria Santos called the meeting to order, her presence lending official weight to the proceedings. "We're here tonight to discuss the proposal put forward by Elena Vasquez and supported by the Whitmore family, regarding the establishment of what's being called the Whitmore Vasquez Foundation for Environmental Refugees." Elena stepped to the podium, her voice carrying clearly across the room, filled with neighbors, local officials, and curious community members. 3 weeks ago, my son and I discovered gold coins and a journal hidden in a 1940s windmill. What we found wasn't treasure in the conventional sense. It was a responsibility passed down through generations. She gestured toward Ruth Whitmore, who sat with quiet dignity in the second row. Mrs. Ruth Whitmore has shared with us her father-in-law Joseph's explicit wishes that this money continue to help displaced families find new homes and opportunities. Tonight, we're asking for your support in honoring that mission. Father Gabriel Martinez rose from his seat near the middle of the room. Elena, can you explain how this foundation would actually work? What kinds of families would it help? Elena had prepared for this question during long conversations with Miguel, James, and Professor Blackwood. The foundation would assist families displaced by environmental disasters, wildfires, floods, extreme weather events that are becoming more common in our region. We'd provide temporary housing assistance, job training, and help with relocation costs for families who can't return to their original homes. James Whitmore stood up, drawing surprised looks from community members who knew about his initial legal challenge. I want to add something. When my mother shared my great-grandfather's letter with us, I realized I'd been thinking about this situation all wrong. I was focused on reclaiming family property, but Joseph never intended this money to belong to any one family. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward James, whose journey from antagonist to ally had surprised everyone, including himself. James has agreed to serve as co-trustee of the foundation, bringing his real estate development expertise to help families find permanent housing solutions. Dorothy Henley raised her hand, her voice carrying clearly despite her 89 years. What about the historical aspect? Joseph's journal documents important Colorado history. Will that be preserved? Professor Blackwood rose to address this concern. Colorado State University has agreed to digitize and preserve Joseph's journal and all related documentation as part of our Depression-era research archives. Miguel Vasquez's restoration work and Tommy Chen's documentary footage will also be preserved for future historians. Miguel stood up, his voice more confident than Elena had ever heard it. The windmill itself will be restored to working condition and installed in the town square as a monument to the families who helped each other during the Depression. It will also serve as a symbol of our community's commitment to continuing that tradition of mutual aid. Elena watched her son with pride, seeing how this experience had transformed him from a curious teenager into someone who understood the weight of historical responsibility. His acceptance letter to Colorado State's engineering program, which had arrived the previous week, was largely the result of his documentation of the windmill restoration process. A voice called out from the back of the room. What about the legal issues? The bank robbery money? Sheriff Santos stood to address this concern. After extensive consultation with federal and state authorities, we've determined that the statute of limitations on the original theft has expired. More importantly, the historical context provided by Joseph's journal makes it clear that any problematic money was unknowingly contributed by families seeking legitimate help. Elena continued, the foundation will be established with full transparency and oversight. All financial records will be public, and community members will serve on the board of directors to ensure accountability. An older man near the front raised his hand. How much money are we talking about? Elena had dreaded this question, knowing that the specific amount might overshadow the foundation's mission. The gold coins have been appraised at approximately $280,000. Combined with matching grants we've secured from environmental organizations, the foundation will start with nearly $500,000 in resources. A murmur ran through the room. For a small mountain town like Cedar Ridge, it was a substantial sum that could make a real difference in people's lives. Ruth Whitmore stood slowly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through the Depression and understood both the value of money and the greater value of using it wisely. I want to share something Joseph wrote in a letter I found among his papers. Money is only valuable when it moves, when it helps people build better lives. Gold that sits hidden serves no one, but gold that helps families find their footing can change generations. Elena felt the room's energy shift toward approval. These were people who understood hard times and the importance of community support. They'd seen neighbors help neighbors through economic downturns, natural disasters, and personal crises. Tommy raised his hand. What about families who might try to take advantage of the foundation? James answered this time. We've developed screening procedures based on documented need and community references. This isn't charity. It's investment in families who are committed to rebuilding their lives but need temporary support to make that possible. Father Martinez stood again. I move that we support the establishment of this foundation. It honors our community's values and provides practical help for families facing the kind of displacement that's becoming more common in our changing climate. The motion was seconded immediately, and Elena felt her heart racing as Sheriff Santos called for discussion. One by one, community members stood to voice their support, share stories of their own family's struggles, and express pride in Cedar Ridge's commitment to continuing Joseph Whitmore's mission. When the vote was called, the result was overwhelming, 47 in favor, 3 opposed, with 2 abstentions. Elena felt tears threatening as she realized that her desperate $15 gamble had led not just to her family's financial stability, but to something much larger, a community coming together to help families find their way to better lives. Miguel approached the podium as the meeting wound down. I want to thank everyone for supporting this foundation. What we learned from Joseph Whitmore's journal is that individual acts of kindness become community traditions when enough people commit to them. Tonight, you've proven that Cedar Ridge understands that responsibility. As people filed out of the community center, Elena found herself surrounded by neighbors offering to volunteer, donate additional resources, and help identify families who might benefit from the foundation's assistance. James approached her with his mother, both of them smiling. Elena, I owe you an apology for how I handled this initially. My great-grandfather would be proud of what you've created here. Ruth nodded approvingly. Joseph always believed that the best way to honor the past was to build something better for the future. This foundation does exactly that. Elena looked around the emptying community center, seeing volunteers organizing committees, Tommy interviewing community members for his documentary, and Miguel discussing windmill installation logistics with the town maintenance supervisor. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a struggling single mother desperate enough to bid on junk at a foreclosure auction. Tonight, she was the co-founder of an organization that would help families for generations to come. The gold coins had been valuable, but the real treasure was discovering that her community shared Joseph Whitmore's understanding that helping others was not just a moral obligation, but the foundation of building something lasting and meaningful. As Elena drove home through the mountain darkness, she reflected on how the windmill that had brought them together would soon turn again in Cedar Ridge's town square, a visible symbol of the community's commitment to helping families find their way home. 6 months later, Elena stood in Cedar Ridge's town square, watching the restored windmill's blades catch the morning light as they turned steadily in the mountain breeze. The bronze plaque at its base bore Joseph Whitmore's words, "For those who come after, may you understand what we tried to do." And the Whitmore Vasquez Foundation for Environmental Refugees had already helped 11 families displaced by last summer's wildfire season find new homes and employment in the region. Elena's renewable energy consulting business had grown exponentially, fueled by foundation connections and her newfound reputation as someone who understood both technology and community needs. The Martinez family arrives this afternoon, James Whitmore said, joining her beside the windmill. Their partnership had surprised everyone, including themselves, but James's real estate expertise and Elena's engineering background had proven complementary in ways neither had anticipated. Elena nodded, checking her tablet for the day's schedule. The Martinez family, no relation to Father Gabriel, had lost their home and auto repair shop to flooding in southern Colorado. The foundation would provide temporary housing, while James helped them identify a suitable property for rebuilding their business. Miguel's documentary premieres tonight, she reminded James. Are you and your mother planning to attend? James smiled. Wouldn't miss it. Ruth's been looking forward to it for weeks. She says it's the first time our family's story has been told honestly. Tommy's documentary, The Windmill Papers, had been accepted into 3 regional film festivals after its local premiere. The film traced the discovery of the treasure through the foundation's establishment. But its real power lay in connecting Joseph Whitmore's Depression-era humanitarian network to contemporary environmental displacement issues. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Miguel, who was finishing his freshman year at Colorado State University. Documentary showing at CSU next week. Professor Blackwood says attendance is mandatory for all her students. Pretty cool that my high school project is now required college viewing. The pride Elena felt in her son's academic success was matched by her satisfaction in watching him mature into someone who understood that privilege came with responsibility. Miguel's engineering scholarship, earned partly through his windmill restoration documentation, had freed him to focus on his studies while contributing to the foundation's technical projects during breaks. Elena? A tentative voice interrupted her thoughts. A young woman with 2 children approached hesitantly, carrying a worn backpack and looking around the town square with the cautious hope of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. I'm Elena Vasquez. Can I help you? I'm Sarah Chen, Tommy Chen's cousin. He said you might be able to help us. The woman's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been traveling too long with too little certainty about their destination. We'd lost our place in the Marshall fire last year. Been staying with relatives, but she gestured toward her children, a boy about 8 and a girl perhaps 10. They need stability, a real home. Elena felt the familiar mixture of sympathy and determination that had driven Joseph Whitmore's work decades earlier. Sarah, let's get you and your children some lunch, and then we'll talk about what the foundation might be able to do to help. As they walked toward the diner, Elena reflected on how the foundation had evolved beyond even their initial vision. Word of their work had spread through networks of displaced families, creating an informal communication system that reminded her of the way desperate families had found Joseph Whitmore's way station during the Depression. The afternoon brought its usual mix of administrative work, family interviews, and coordination calls with partner organizations. Elena had hired 2 staff members, a social worker and a housing coordinator, but she still handled much of the direct family contact herself, understanding that people in crisis needed to feel heard by someone who genuinely cared about their situation. At 6 that evening, the Cedar Ridge Community Center filled with people gathering for Tommy's documentary premiere. Elena saw faces she recognized from the foundation's town hall meeting, mixed with newer residents who'd moved to the area, partly because of Cedar Ridge's reputation for community support. Tommy, now a freshman at Colorado Film School, introduced his documentary with the confidence of someone who'd found his calling. This film started as a high school project about renewable energy. It became something bigger when we realized that every community has hidden stories about how people have helped each other survive difficult times. As the lights dimmed and the documentary began, Elena watched her neighbors' faces, illuminated by images of Miguel carefully dismantling the windmill, Professor Blackwood examining Joseph's journal, and Ruth Whitmore sharing family secrets that had been hidden for generations. The film's most powerful moment came when Ruth read Joseph's letter aloud, her voice carrying across the community center with the same authority it had carried in Elena's dining room months earlier. This gold is not meant to enrich anyone's heirs. It exists to continue the work of helping displaced families find their way to better lives. During the Q&A session afterward, Dorothy Henley stood with some difficulty, her sharp mind undimmed by her approaching 90th birthday. I want to say something to the young people here tonight. What you've seen in this film is how history really works, not through famous people making grand gestures, but through ordinary people making daily choices to help their neighbors. Elena felt tears threatening as she realized how completely their community had embraced Joseph's mission. The foundation wasn't just helping individual families, it was preserving and extending a tradition of mutual aid that had sustained communities through every crisis in American history. After the screening, Elena found herself surrounded by people sharing their own family stories of displacement, recovery, and community support. A rancher whose grandfather had lost his farm in the Dust Bowl. A woman whose family had fled Vietnam in the 1970s. A young father whose house had burned in last year's wildfire. Father Gabriel Martinez approached as the crowd thinned. Elena, I wanted to thank you for what you've built here. This foundation has given our community a way to live our values practically, not just talk about them on Sundays. Elena laughed, remembering her anxious visit to his church months earlier when she'd been wrestling with the moral implications of their discovery. Father, I think Joseph Whitmore would be amazed to see how his simple act of hiding gold in a windmill has brought so many people together. Simple acts often have the most profound consequences, he replied. The question is whether we're wise enough to recognize them when they happen. As Elena drove home that night, she passed the Martinez family's temporary housing, a small apartment the foundation maintained for families in transition. Lights were on in the windows, and she could see shadows of people moving around inside, probably unpacking, settling in, beginning the slow process of rebuilding their lives. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. Miguel's voice came through clearly, despite the distance between Cedar Ridge and Fort Collins. Mom, I watched the live stream of the documentary premiere. The comments section was incredible. People from all over Colorado asking how they can start similar programs in their communities. Elena felt a surge of pride, not just in her son, but in what they'd all accomplished together. Miguel, what do you think Joseph would say if he could see what's happened? Miguel was quiet for a moment. I think he'd say that the best way to honor the past is to build something better for the future. And I think he'd be proud that we figured out how to do both. After ending the call, Elena sat in her car for a few minutes, looking up at the stars that seemed brighter in Cedar Ridge's clear mountain air. The windmill in the town square was invisible in the darkness, but she could hear the faint whisper of its blades turning in the night breeze. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate single mother gambling $15 on a broken windmill, hoping to salvage enough copper to pay her son's college application fees. Tonight, she was the co-director of a foundation that had helped dozens of families find new homes and hope, while preserving a piece of American history that might otherwise have been lost forever. The real treasure hadn't been the gold coins hidden in Joseph Whitmore's windmill. It had been discovering that their small community possessed the same spirit of mutual aid that had sustained families through the Great Depression, and that they were willing to commit that spirit to helping families facing the environmental challenges of their own era. As Elena finally walked toward her house, she thought about the Martinez family settling into their temporary home, about Miguel studying engineering, with the confidence that comes from understanding how individual choices can have lasting impact, and about the 11 families who were building new lives, because a community had chosen to honor the legacy of a man who'd understood that helping others was the most valuable thing anyone could do with whatever resources they possessed. The windmill would keep turning in the town square, its blades catching wind and generating the small amount of electricity that powered the memorial's lighting. But its real purpose was symbolic, a reminder that some things endure across generations when communities commit to preserving what matters most. Joseph Whitmore's mission lived on, carried forward by people who understood that the true measure of wealth was not what you accumulated, but what you used to help others build better lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.